Nile Valley civilization and Nile Valley, just information going on with respect to the Nile Valley. So I've been reading a lot about this and talking a lot about this and really just kind of going through some of the information with respect to ancient Nubia, ancient Kush, ancient Kemet, and looking at the whole Nile Valley civilization. As we've talked before, I've kind of showed you some of the timeline of some of the things that I've been looking at on some of them going with respect to Kerma and early Kerma and ancient Kush. And you start to look at some of these things and really start to look at the whole area that is the Nile Valley. You start to see that there are similarities develop. A lot of people want to make differences. They want to take and kind of slice up things and make it seem like this was not a contribution of many people there, and that the many people who lived in Africa and that part of Africa for many, many years before ancient Kemet even became a country somehow were not a part of this Nile Valley civilization that developed, that became Kemet and Kush and various things where they punt all of that somehow that was not connected and they were not a part of these things that developed it. But the archaeology says something different. And I think it's time that we look at things and relook at things. One of the things that happened with ancient Kush and Nubia and ancient Kemet with respect to that is that a lot of the archaeology that took place, now you got to remember that, for a long period of time, for a large part of recent history, people didn't even know what the hieroglyphs meant. They didn't even know how to read them. You know what I mean? People did not know. It wasn't until relatively recently within, the recent past or recent history that people even deciphered the hieroglyphs. So we didn't even know what they meant for a long period of time. And so a lot of people were saying maybe this to that. They didn't know. And when the archaeology started that people call Egyptology, when that started in the 1800s, the latter part of the 1800s and the 1800s and the early 1900s, it was ripe with racism. I mean, it just was. I mean, you can see things with whether it's George Reisner or various people who did a lot of research, and they did a lot of research uncovering a lot of things, and a lot of the things they looked at, some of the things they looked at, they just assumed were not Nubian. They just assumed had nothing to do with ancient Kush, that they were all Kemetic, they were all Egyptian, if you will, and they had nothing to do with other populations that were there in Africa. As time has gone on, that's been proven to be wrong. That's been proven that there's a whole civilization and civilizations that were there that we know about that were just overlooked in the first part of the archaeological evidence that was looked at, if you will. So as we start to look at that and kind of jump, there's a whole lot that's going on in ancient Kemet, in Kush, in the whole Nile Valley, and we need to look at. We need to give people their propers. We don't just need to say there was just one group of people, one type of people, and they were separated from the other. And this was not something that was really more cohesive in terms of how people work together than it actually, than it actually was. We really have to look at what it was actually like and how people actually interact with one another and what the evidence tells us. So one of the things that jump out at us is we talk about ancient Kush. We talk about things with respect to pre-Kerma and that whole area, 3500 BC, and looking there around, the third cataract of the Nile in what is today modern day Sudan. We know, archaeologists know now that was a civilization, and that was a civilization many thousands of years before that, many thousands of years before 3500 BC. And 3500 BC, by the way, is before ancient Kemet, before the first dynasty, before ancient Kemet becomes a unified country, if you will. That's before that. You have, civilizations, you have archaeology and artifacts and trade and all kinds of things going up and down the Nile Valley. We like to pigeonhole things, but these things are happening up and down the Nile Valley, because human beings are doing it. Yeah, this is what human beings do. And a lot of times we want to kind of put things in a particular way, but human beings do this. So as we think about this whole Nile Valley part, and Nile Valley civilization, we have to look at the whole thing. We have to look all up and down here. And there's a lot that's going on right here in what is considered Lower Nubia that we just overlooked. I mean, with respect to the archaeology that first took place in the 1800s and in the early 1900s, there was a lot of bias. There was a lot of racism there. There were things that we now know were just simply overlooked. More recent archaeology has shown and uncovered things, like I said, in ancient Kerma, as well as in Qustul. And I know some people say Qustul. So we may say Qustul, but I'm going to probably say Qustul throughout this presentation. So don't get mad at me. That's what I'm going to probably say Qustul. But there were all kinds of things happening in that border between ancient Kemet and what is the modern day Sudan. So what is modern day Egypt and modern day Sudan, that whole border right there, which is Lower Nubia. There was a lot going on. And the A group Nubians, as we know, were all a part. They were up into what is today, Egypt and what was at the time and would become Kemet. They were in Kemet proper. They were above the border, which is the first cataract. That was the southern border of ancient Kemet in history. The A group Nubians, Nubian people, obviously we know from archaeological finds, from grave sites, from information in cemeteries that they left, that they were there. And they were right there with a distinct and unique culture. Doesn't mean that they were completely ethnically different. They might not have been completely ethnically different. They may not be completely of a different heritage, but they were developing different value systems and different traditions and different customs, if you will. And so it doesn't mean that they weren't black. It doesn't mean that they weren't ethnically related to the people already there. They were developing societies, right? And people began to develop their own ways of doing things. They began to develop their own belief systems. They began to develop their own traditions. And you see that in everywhere. You see that like everywhere you go. And so that's no different in ancient Kemet. But it does not mean that you did not have different people who may have looked similar or different people who may have looked different, right? Who came from different parts of the world interacting in the ways people interact. So as we look at ancient Kemet, we look at A group Nubians, we look at Qustul, we look at the information all around it, you start to see that there are people, human beings, just like you and I, Homo sapiens sapiens, who are living and loving and going to war and trading and having intercourse and all types of interrelations with each other as people normally do. And to think that somehow there was not this correlation, which we now see in the archaeological evidence, it's kind of ridiculous to deny that or to not admit that. And so as you start to think about this, not only was the A group Nubians, who were around maybe 3800 BC, and this is before Kemet becomes a country, if you will, not only were they in what would become Kemet proper, so they were up in here in Kubania, they were down in Qustul. You even find places like Sai Island, when you get into what is modern day Sudan. You even find places like Sai Island that was inhabited hundreds of thousands of years ago. They have that you can go back 200,000, 300,000 years and find activity, human ancestral activity on Sai Island right here in what is modern day Sudan. So this idea that somehow people were, and our ancestors, human ancestors, were not up and down the Nile Valley for hundreds of thousands of years is kind of ridiculous, right? And so when we think about ancient Kemet and we think about Nubia, we don't have to separate these customs, so to speak. We don't have to separate these customs as much as we do. And I want to tell you why as we kind of jump into that. I want to tell you why we don't have to separate these customs as much as we do. You start to think about certain things that were found in artifacts. Because one of the things that jumps out at you is that in the archaeological record, as they began to first look at this whole area and excavate this whole area in ancient Kemet and in Nubia and in Kerma and places like that, initially they just were racist and they said racist things. You can go back and read Rising. You can read many of these people and you can see very racist things being said. And they were wrong. Archaeologists decades later came around and proved that they were wrong. No, this wasn't an Egyptian, foundation in what is, modern day Kerma in the past. This was actually an indigenous, different people, Nubian people, building their own facilities, having trade up and down the Nile Valley. It wasn't all one-sided. We think that it was just this one-sided thing. And in reality, it was a much more fluid situation. In addition to that, one of the things as racism has impacted archaeology, has impacted our idea of history, has impacted our idea of seeing what we have in common and how many different people have contributed to society. I think we should talk about it. I want to hear about ancient Egypt and ancient Kemet in classes and in schools. I want to hear about China. I want to hear about ancient UK. I want to hear about the Olmecs. I want to hear about all kinds of people and their contributions and things they did. I think it's remarkable. And I think it should be in everybody's classroom. I think we should be teaching that type of thing. And so as I think about that, one of the other things that developed as archaeology continued to develop in the 20th century, you find, obviously, as you go up and down the Nile Valley, that there is now a huge dam, the Aswan Dam, that has flooded a lot of things. So you're talking about like the 1960s. There were several stages of this. So you had smaller dams earlier in the 20th century, several stages of it. But the high dam, which flooded a whole lot of area and created a huge lake. So they could use it for electricity and for power, for generation, and for a number of things. So they have more predictability in the Nile that rises and falls. That was taking place, and you can read up about UNESCO. You can go and search, and you can read about archaeologists and what they were finding was there was a rush when the dam was being built to find as much as they could, especially in this area that was Nubia. This is Lower Nubia. This right here between the first cataract and around this border, around the second cataract of the Nile, right there around the border of the Sudan and modern day Egypt. This is Lower Nubia. This is Nubia. And as you get farther south, this is Upper Nubia. And you find places like Yam and Kush and places like that. This is Nubia. And there was a lot of Nubian artifacts, graves, cemeteries, whole entire cemeteries, resources, settlements were flooded. Right. So I don't even know if we got a chance to really look at a lot of the stuff that was there. And hopefully we will. I believe one day there'll be more information that will surface, maybe in more than one way. Things will surface. But a lot of that was also flooded. So you'll see the archaeologists talk about that. There was a race to find as much as they could. Even though, and then you think about that happening in the 1960s, and prior to that, for years, for decades, there being a whole lot of racism tainting the science of archaeology. So this whole idea that, there could possibly be a connection between the people who lived in Lower Nubia, who lived in what will become Kemet proper, and their ideals and the ideals that were developing in ancient Kemet, that there could be a connection there, that they both shared some values and some belief is not, it's amazing. And it's not something that we should scoff at or just say, that's not possible. It's not possible. They could, but the archaeology shows something different. Obviously they could have, and they did. So as we start to think about that, one of the things we jump out, there are several symbols that became significant in the ancient Kemetic just dynastic period. When you think about the dynasty of Kemet, one of the things that's important when you think about ancient Kemet and you think about just in general what was happening around 4000 BC to 3100 BC, where you start to have the development of the Nakada or Nakeda, if you want to pronounce it, the Nakada period, you start to see the development of writing. You start to see the development of their calendar, most likely. You start to see development of the religious beliefs and symbols. And it's so much so that the end of this pre-dynastic period in ancient Kemet really just flows right into the dynastic period. There really is no archaeological artifacts or materials that says this is when the pre-dynastic period ended and this is when the first dynasty began. That's why you have people talk about Dynasty Zero and just that blending that took place. There was literally like it was lock and step. That pre-dynastic belief and that pre-dynastic belief system from a religious standpoint, from a writing standpoint, flowed right into that dynasty and into the development of the two lands, and into the development where you had the joining of Upper and Lower Kemet for an extended period of time where they became a political entity that we recognize today, that we look back on, right, today. But there were several symbols that became iconic when it comes to ancient Kemet, and those symbols have to do with the white crown of Upper Kemet. So as we start to think about where Upper Kemet is the southern part. It's the southern part of Kemet, right? So this is the southern part of Kemet. It's the upper part. It's where the Nile is flowing from the highlands of Ethiopia. It gets lower and lower further down as it goes up into the Delta. This is Upper Kemet. In Upper Kemet, you had distinct symbols that represented divinity, that represented kingship, that represented rulership, if you will. And those distinct symbols, one of them was the white crown. That was a distinct, and you see the white crown of Upper Kemet in various things as we look at today. As I kind of just pull this up and you kind of look at it, you see that white crown, and you can see right on his head the deity holding and wearing the white crown of Upper Kemet. This is something that lasted throughout Kemet's entire history, basically throughout its entire history. You can see kings wearing the white crown of Upper Kemet throughout its entire history. You see Ausar and various deities looking at and holding that white crown. Well, that white crown was also found in Qustul. It wasn't just found in Qustul. It's the famous Qustul incense burner that everybody talks about, that the University of Chicago excavated, and that you can read the archaeologist Williams and his write-ups on it. You can read the University of Chicago's write-ups on it. It isn't just the Qustul. It isn't just Qustul. It isn't just one incense burner. You find these symbols of pharaonic and dynastic Kemet in this part in Lower Nubian artifacts. So much so that they're not just artifacts. People say, well, they must have been given to them by ancient Egypt. Like not so. They weren't artifacts that were just given to them, or they weren't just impersonating Egypt. They weren't walking around impersonating the people in Lower Kemet. These were actually things that were part of their value system. You see it so much. Not only do you see that white crown that we talk about on the famous Qustul incense burner, which you can look up, and I encourage you to read it. Like, look it up. Look up the University of Chicago. Look up the archaeologist Williams. You'll be able to find Read, find their write-ups. Look at what they had to say. Judge it for yourself. Don't just look at what you see on TV and what you see like online. Look this up and read it for yourself and see, what are they talking about? What is their evidence? What did they find, right? Why was this significant, So this particular incense burner, which was uniquely Nubian, right? And it wasn't just one incense burner. It was several incense burners. There were several artifacts and seals that show pharaonic symbols before ancient Kemet becomes a country. So before you have the unification of the upper and lower Kemet, and remember, these beliefs were already in place in this whole area in ancient Kemet before it became one unified country. These beliefs were already in place, and they were in place amongst A group Nubians. They were in place amongst Nubians. I mean, that's the significant part. The Nubian people believed in it. They had artifacts that showed the white crown of Upper Kemet. That white crown might not have been just the white crown of Upper Kemet. It was a white crown because they wore it too. Not only did you see the white crown in symbols and seals and other artifacts that they had that we found in their cemeteries, you also find another significant symbol that is a part of Kemetic pharaonic ideals, and that is the serekh right here, and it is something that stands out uniquely, because when you see this white crown and these incense burners and the seals and the artifacts, and this is the stuff that was left, these are the things that were found. You're talking about excavation and archaeology that took place in the 1900s and the 20th century and beyond, right? This is something that, for graves that have been there for thousands of years, literally thousands of years, the graves have been robbed. Many of the graves that they found in the 20th century and in the 21st century that they found had been robbed in antiquity. So these are the things that they were able to find. And you have, on top of that, the flooding of Lake Nasser in the decades ago, in the 1960s, and you end up having, and that whole creation of the dam there and the flooding and creating that dam, you have a lot of things that are may have been open to other people's eyes to look at, that have just been kind of overlooked or are underwater, which hopefully one day will come into being, if you will. But this becomes this whole symbol of a serekh and some of the things that they found. And even with all those things in fact, even after thousands of years, even after it being underwater in Lake Nasser, they still found enough evidence to show that the Nubian people in Qustul and in other areas up and down the Nile Valley had their own ideas and beliefs that were similar, that were reflective of what was happening in the Nile Valley. So this serekh here, this symbol is an important symbol. This is actually the name of a Dynasty 2 pharaoh, a Dynasty 2 king in ancient Kemet. This is actually the name of a Dynasty 2. God bless you. Hope you're having a good way. This is actually the name of a Dynasty 2 pharaoh, if you will, that was, this is the early dynastic period. This is something that was representative of their name. So when you see something like this serekh, you will notice that in ancient Kemet, they had these cartouches, and these cartouches were similar to this, but they were kind of round, they were kind of oval shape, and that would represent the king's name. Many times, if you were talking about a king, the king's name would be written with a cartouche, especially when you look at later on in ancient Kemetic history. But for this right here, this is before there was a cartouche, there was a serekh. And this serekh is in Dynasty 2. And you find the same type of serekh in Qustul before Kemet becomes a country. And just to show you what the serekh is a rectangular shape. And at the bottom here is like a facade. So imagine the palace or the building in which the king may have stayed, may have lived, right? And it was kind of decorated with a series of rectangles. This is to represent the outside of the facade, if you will, where the king may have stayed, of a building or the king's palace is believed. So that will represent the bottom part. The top part where the square is up top, that represents kind of a bird's eye view of the inside of the palace, the inside of the building where the king may have stayed, with the palace where the king stayed. So it might be the courtyard. And then you have inside there, then you have the name of the king. So you have the king's name kind of written inside that. And on top of it is a falcon. And that falcon is representative of Aru. So when you see this, when they went back to Qustul and they did digging and then looked at ancient Kemet and looked at, things that were happening pre-dynastic, pre the creation of various challenges there, they still found artifacts that represented significant symbols that were in place during the pharaonic and dynastic time of Kemet, before there was a Kemet, down in what was lower Nubia, down in what was Nubia proper. And you find not only the white crown there that was symbolic of Upper Kemet, that white crown was there, you find this incredible serekh. And you find in particular on the Qustul incense burner, but there are other incense burners and there are other seals. It's not just one artifact. You find a depiction of a man sitting having the white crown on, and you see this symbol of a serekh where you have three boats being pulled towards a serekh, a palace facade. And that facade is written in much the same way, very similar, but on unique Nubian artifacts, very similar in the way it was written in Nekhen years earlier, and it would become ancient Kemet. Very similar to scenes that were shown there. You have the same symbol, but it's being used for a Nubian king, a Nubian ruler. And that becomes significant because you find that, wait a minute, or they think of the same things. Why did they have the same symbol? And you find that on enough artifacts to understand that this wasn't an artifact that was imported from ancient Kemet. These were Nubian artifacts that they made that had these symbols on it. This was a part of their culture. This was something they saw. So whether you want to say, hey, this was something that they got from Egypt, or Egypt gave it to them, or they gave it to Egypt, or something that just grew out of the Nile Valley and their experiences and their beliefs in this part of the world, in this part of Africa, however you want to look at, which is probably what happened, these were shared beliefs. When people look at the Nubian culture and look at the 25th dynasty that came on much, much later, years later, they saw themselves as being the true holders of what the Kemetic people were practicing. They saw themselves, and it may not be just because they were occupied by Kemet for some 500 years earlier. It may be because in their distant mind, in their distant past, they had an idea that they were always looking at these things, that some of the things that were symbols were always significant to them. Maybe that was something they believed. Maybe they weren't crazy after all. A lot of times you read them talking about the 25th dynasty, and they really weren't the 25th dynasty. They were the kings of their own land. They took over ancient Kemet. But we talk about them as if they were somehow kind of delusional in that they were, practicing Kemetic religion and Kemetic thought and that type of thing. But, in some ways they may not have been. This whole idea of Qustul and this whole idea of the serekh and kingship and rulership being significant was in place in Nubia before Kemet became a country. It was in place before Kemet became a country. And that becomes very significant because we're not talking about, copying here. We're talking about very significant pharaonic details and beliefs and belief systems that the Nubian people at Qustul were burying and believing in an afterlife and believing in themselves as God and a manifestation of God well before Kemet becomes a country. The other thing that sticks out about this in this serekh is the deity that's up top. That's the falcon. That's Haru. When you hear about Haru and you see Haru and you start to hear about this, we talk about the falcon god Haru. Haru becomes, as you read about ancient Kemet, Haru is the rightful ruler. Haru sits on the throne in place of his father Asar. And the king of ancient Kemet and the king in Nile Valley was considered to be an Haru, the person who's sitting on the throne in rightful heirship, the person who had the right to the throne and was ruling, in a deified way in place of Asar. And so when you think about that, symbolism was in place in Qustul, in Nubia, before Kemet became a country, before 3100, that symbolism of the falcon of Haru was in place. And it was in place in Kemet too, but it was in place in Nubia. And so as I stopped to think about that, and I started to think about, and these are just a few of the symbols. I think about the white crown, the serekhs, as we talk about, the idea of Haru. I think about these symbols being in place in Nubia before Kemet became a country. And you start to say, wait a minute, these are Nubian ideals too. Whether we want to say who came first with it, these are Nubian ideas. We can embrace this. This doesn't have to be something where we have to say this is Kemetic culture and this is cultures away from us, and it's not connected with Kush. It's not connected with Yam. It's not connected with the things that were happening in Nubia, in Tasseti, which it was called. It's not connected. It absolutely was connected. A lot of the same symbolism, a lot of the same belief systems there. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. I want to share more with it. I want to go further into this topic, if you will. So I'd love to hear your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you find out, because I know there are people who have done a lot of research on this that you can share this. Share this with the world. Share this with this community, with our community, and let's find out more about how these ideals are shared, what kinds of things we thought about, what kinds of things were thought about way back when we start to try to separate people and are not really separated. How does Nubia really connect to some of these things with respect to Haru, with respect to the falcon deity, with respect to serekhs and the white crown? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So thank you so much for listening. I'll be coming back with more, and God bless you. I'll talk to you soon.